Yes, it's a pleasure and an honor to be here and speak again under the rubric of the Beck lecture series. And I'd like to, as in my other lectures, to thank those who have brought me here and helped me. Helga Thorsson, who is my host now, and John Tucker, who was my host last time I came in 2010, and Trish, who's been of enormous help both times. So this talk, Searching for Iceland, a literary quest, emerges from my long-standing interest in the role of places in literary works, the character of places as constructed by literary texts, those being one of the main scenes of the art of language. But the art of language, of course, is more widespread than that. It happens all the time, even in our everyday conversations. But this character of places, in its weight, may be on par with the most significant characters, in a slightly different sense, in the respective literary works. Dublin is a character in Joyce's Ulysses. The farmstead and its surroundings in Laxness's Independent People is of enormous importance. But it is important not to be too deterministic in this. This element in literary works varies a great deal, as we see most clearly in poetry. There are poems and even some short stories where it may be hard to find any place except inside the speaker of the poem. And on the other side of the spectrum, there is poetry, which is often called poetry of place, where place is of central importance. To mention but one example, one of the most famous examples in Western literature of poetry of place, William Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey. It's simply not possible to think away the place in that poem. This talk is perhaps on the wild and risky side of place studies. Can one really talk about a country as a place? Is Canada a place? I'm not sure. It's an idea. It's a social contract. It's a geopolitical entity, and so on. And it's a whole series of places. But a place may be hard to pinpoint it that way. Similarly, I can sympathize with, for instance, a Sicilian reader who says of the Italy portrayed by a Milanese writer, "This is not my Italy." But that response may also indicate that a certain search is taking place. And when we move over to smaller countries and populations thought to be fairly homogeneous, not to mention island nations, this approach may seem more feasible. And I'm not forgetting the many divided islands of the world, Ireland, Cyprus, the island of Timor, and so on. Many island nations have a history of colonialization as part of their identity, usually in the sense of having been colonized, but there are also big colonizers among island nations, Great Britain and Japan. This talk is about an island and an island nation, and if this approach makes sense in the case of Iceland, then it is perhaps because the clearly demarcated and limited sphere, as well as the small and manageable population under scrutiny, may be an acceptable laboratory. Of course, the Icelandic nation is not very manageable, but so be it. So, enough preambling. Where do I begin this erratic search? And I'm not going to speak so formally for much of this talk. Let's begin with the enfant terrible of Icelandic literature and one of its greatest writers, Guðbergur Bergsson, who is still active. He's 84 now. He is the great resister, the great iconoclaster of any self-satisfied notions about what is sacrosanct in the Icelandic common domain. He's the great ironist and satirist of Icelandic literature in the second half of the 20th century. In many ways, a self-appointed exile, citizen of the world, although very much someone who is closely linked to Spain and the Spanish world, as well as Iceland. But one wonders, and I did wonder back in 97, 98, when these books came out, which he called Skaldævisögur, kind of a novel biographies, or sort of what is sometimes called biofiction or auto-fiction these days. That is to say, these are autobiographical books about his childhood, but he claims that the laws of literature, the laws of literary creation are at work in these books. And in these books, this ironist and satirist embraces his childhood in the fishing village of Grindavik on the south coast of Iceland. He has even bought back part of the house where he grew up. He is revisiting the places where he played in childhood, the ground where he dug down the first poems he wrote as a child. It's a wonderful scene in one of those books. And first, he put them in a little box, and he dug them down in the ground. They very sort of kind of poetic motion. And it turns out that this is a small town where nothing happened, in one sense, but it's also a town full of local drama. Is this his, as I ask there, his Gunnarsholmi and his reclaimed Hlíðarendi? I'll explain that further. Or a heroic return after an extended exile? Has he found Iceland, in other words, in a certain place, namely the village of his childhood? I take these terms, these names, Gunnarsholmi and Hlíðarendi, from firstly from Jónas Hallgrímsson, a key poet of the 19th century, of 19th century Romanticism in Iceland. A major force in discovering the beauty of Icelandic nature at the time, and a rediscoverer of Iceland's golden age, when timeless masterpieces were created, as he felt in some of his contemporaries, fruits of the island's early centuries of independence. So this poem, Gunnarsholmi, recreates a scene from the saga of Njál. So what we're doing here is we're stepping back from the contemporary writer into the 19th century, and then from there into the Middle Ages. He recreates a famous scene with Gunnar Hallmundarson, who has been exiled, one of the great heroes of this saga, who has been exiled, maybe unfairly, and is about to leave Iceland. He has to leave for 3 years. According to the law at the time, there were two kinds of outlawry. This was so-called lesser outlawry. You had to leave the country and stay away 3 years. And it's a scene where his brother, who has spent a lot of time abroad, is going with him, and he's very pleased that Gunnar has finally been convinced to actually leave, because if he stays, his life is at risk. Because those outlaws who did not leave the country could practically be killed by anyone. But then, as Njál saga has it, his horse kind of falters a little bit, so he stops and he turns the horse around and he looks back from south of his farmlands, and looks over his farmlands and to his farm, and says famous words in Iceland, "Fögur er hlíðin," and so on. Beautiful is the slope, and a few more words, and then he says, "I'm not going," and he rides back, and of course then faces bitter death, but dies a great fighter. So Jonas takes this scene and valorizes it. and in the poem, Jonas, or the speaker of the poem, claims to have found this place where Gunnar returned. The place, and he says this is called Gunnarsholmi now, and it's a little island in the middle of the ocean. And he says this, and he kind of sings a hymn in this poem to this place and to Gunnar's decision. And in the poem it says, "Here I'll dwell the days of my life. Here vil ég una ævi minnar daga. Here I'll dwell the days of my life." He said, however many they may be, this is where I'll be. And Jonas, or the speaker of the poem, still wonders on these cold sands, sort of standing on that little island in the river, that the green Gunnarsholmi could withstand the ferocious wave, the waves of in the river, so it's obvious that Gunnarsholmi becomes an icon of Iceland, and literally he's turning the scene into a very patriotic moment, and it has remained so ever since. The turning back of Gunnar is sort of a declaration of patriotism, of this is the place where I want to be, come hell or high water. And now the irony historically, of course, is that Gunnarsholmi did disappear. The river that it was sitting in is a very flexible, typical Icelandic shifting landscape there. The river is meandering all over the place, eroding constantly. So, and although there are farmers in the neighborhood who will try to convince you, no, I know where Gunnarsholmi is, and then try to take you to that place, because that place is so important. But it is a kind of a non-place. But it's an idea, and remains a very powerful idea. So, and Jonas thus also played a part in making one of the sagas, the Saga of Njál, a sort of national epic. Of all the sagas, this is the one that has sort of that status in Iceland. Now, the Gunnar Hámundarson, I think I may have said Hallmundarson before, Hámundarson, of course, was outlawed from his native soil but refused to leave. However, as I say, that the sagas of Icelanders can be seen as manifesting a kind of ur-mythos, basic sort of myth about chieftains who resist the unification of Norway under a single crown and establish an outlaw society without a state. And thus Iceland remained independent for a number of centuries without having any state apparatus. And it had, however, the need was felt for law and a parliament. And so the irony is that this society soon established its own laws and started outlawing people. But there was no executive power to carry that out. There was no head of state. And thus, if people did not abide by the law, other people, usually the families that had won the case at Althing, had to carry out the sentence themselves. So it was a complicated society in many ways. But because of this situation, Gunnar in Njál's saga, Grettir in the saga of Grettir Gísli Súrsson in his saga, could be called double outlaws in a way, and then there are more of them. At this time, the search of Iceland, it's interesting. I mean, I don't really have time to go into the medieval scene very much here, but it's interesting how this search for Iceland continues. There's partly because of this emphasis on outlawry. The Icelandic chieftain who settled Greenland was Eiríkur Red. He was, of course, like a troublemaker. So he had to leave Iceland, but he found another island and tried to get as many people to move there with him as possible. And the search continued. Of course, they eventually they ended up on mainland North America, but were not able to form a stable settlement. And then this search, this drive, this strange frontier movement also ends up, in the case of some of these outlaws, certainly Grettir and Gíslason, ends up on islands off the island. This is something that I've been looking at with my students in the course that Helga mentioned. The interesting case when a small island off an island assumes a metaphorical relevance. And here in the case of Drangey, in the saga of Grettir the Strong, the island of Drangey becomes, in a way, a second Iceland, an Iceland which is both a mirror and a contrast to the mainland Iceland. So you get a very strong sense of that, I feel, when reading Grettir saga, that Drangey is Iceland in a very strong sense of the word there. And it's also interesting because of the in many ways, solitude of the outlaw, although Grettir was not alone. He had his brother with him. That single rock, isn't it? There used to actually be two of them. There was one in the back that crumbled. So the single rock standing next to the larger, to the island there. Okay. Now, back to Jonas Hallgrímsson, who was later called the national poet. He became, in a way, the national. There are a few poets in Iceland who have had that sort of honorific word used for them, that they are þjóðskáld. That assumes, in a way, that they speak to the whole country. And there again is one of the answers to the question, where do you find Iceland? And Jonas is sometimes just called the national poet. People say, this is what the national poet wrote. Another poem of his that I want to mention here, and this poem is called Iceland. So again, it's the attempt to embrace the country as a place in itself. This is a poem that we all had to learn by heart in school when I was growing up. Ísland farsælda frón og hagsælda hringhvíta móðir, hvar þín fornaldra frægð, frelsið og mandáðin best, allt í heiminum hverfult og stund hins fegursta frama, lýsir sem lyftur nótt langt fram á horfinni öld. This is Dick Ringler's translation. Sometimes he allows himself a good deal of freedom in a very interesting way, and he's translated a lot of Jonas's poetry. And it's all accessible on the web, so it's easy to find if you Google Dick Ringler and Jonas. So this is how Iceland, fortunate isle, oh, our beautiful, bountiful mother, where are your fortune and fame, freedom and virtue of all? He tries to keep the meter. This is unusual in translating poetry, and sort of love the Icelandic characteristics. All things on earth are transient. The days of your greatness and glory flicker like flames in the night, far in the depths of the past. So in this poem, it's quite a long poem. He contrasts contemporary torpor in Iceland with the golden age of ancient Iceland, where horses rode through the regions, and the centerpiece of this verbal trompe-l'oeil is the parliament site, Þingvellir, where the Althing once convened. But the Law Rock, as it says in the poem, is now a place where children and ravens pick berries, because the Althing was closed down at the end of the 18th century. Of course, it had only minimal power or minimal role in that way after Iceland had become a colony, and all major decisions were made in Denmark. But it was still a significant and very important, also symbolic gathering. And at the time, By that time, when that poem was written, or shortly thereafter, there were new plans to re-establish the Althing, and Jonas was very adamant about that this should happen. It should be re-established. I think that is at the old Parliament site, because that place was so important. Now, the other national hero of the 19th century, a man who was really the political leader at the time, Jón Sigurðsson, disagreed and said that the rational thing to do was to re-establish the Althing in Reykjavik, which was slowly becoming the main urban area in Iceland, although still really only a village, very small place. And this is what then happened. The Althing was re-established in Reykjavik. But Jonas still played a significant role in giving Þingvellir an enormous ideological and emotional identity, making it the heart of the country, as it is often referred to today. And in this sense, Jonas is very strongly connected to Þingvellir. So, Þingvellir is Iceland. Just a brief, I want to go through, just very briefly through something. There are so many threads in all this story that I'm telling you. I'm just sort of dipping into a huge story. The rediscovery, as it were, of Iceland with an emphasis on its golden age, the attempt to re-establish its identity was not only a national or internal affair. It was enhanced by a growing interest of many foreigners, onto whose horizon Iceland sort of sailed at the time, starting in the late 18th century. And this time, people who had no economic interest or were not fishing. I mean, there had been foreigners, of course, in Iceland for a long time, but these were people who became interested in it very often because they started reading some of that ancient literature, which was beginning to appear in translations on mainland Europe and in Britain. So travelers started coming to Iceland for the sole purpose of seeing this northern island, very often on a kind of pilgrimage, seeing the saga sites and retracing often steps of the saga heroes and so on. And Icelanders were influenced by this. They started viewing their own country from this perspective. They realized that there was a perspective which was different from theirs, but that they could in a way assimilate. A view which was often quite romantic, although and it's interesting that this is something that has been studied quite thoroughly recently in Iceland, that all the contrasting views of Iceland by those foreign eyes, very often those visitors were not always very happy with what they saw in terms of the people they met and so on. They felt that Icelanders were poor and dirty, their houses were primitive, as were their manners. And there are some accounts where people say, how can this nation have created these great works? This is impossible. They barely know how to say politely hello. But of course, Iceland had been through centuries of poverty, but it must be said, it never lost its literacy. So here, this one I actually used when I gave a lecture on Snæfellsjökull. This is an early view through foreign eyes. August Meyer, who was part of the Geimar expedition in 1836. Jónas Hallgrímsson was fascinated by the Geimar expedition, by the way, and wrote a poem of celebration to its leader, Paul Geimar. A later one. This is Collingwood, who made a famous expedition in much later in the century, 1897, and this is Þingvellir, and he was actually he traced the saga sites, and Þingvellir, of course, is is in a way, the one saga site that unites most of the Icelandic sagas. There was Alþingi every summer, so it was obvious that it would become a narrative site in the sagas. It's interesting that here we have, this is another Collingwood, probably an earlier one, because I think, my wife is actually the artist and the specialist in the visual field. She thinks this must have been painted before Collingwood came to Iceland. So this is a kind of romantic view before he actually sees the island. Then you can see the romantic aspects here. This is what he imagined that the Alþing must have been like. So kind of dramatizing the scenery quite a bit. But then Icelanders started this whole kind of dialogue with these foreign painters and as well as photographers, so that, for instance, only a couple of years later, we have actually, by Þórarinn Þorláksson, again, Þingvellir, this is from the first exhibition of paintings in Iceland, 1900. May seem strange that it happened so late, but our urban culture was very late in forming in Iceland. So again, a key painting of his and reasserting the importance of Þingvellir. I want to go back to Guðbergur Bergsson, to a work that's written before his homecoming, as it were. This is Leitin að landinu fagra, or Searching for the Land of Beauty, a novel published in 1985. And in this novel, Bergsson writes about an island nation. It doesn't say Iceland. It's an island nation who wants to find the land of its dreams. So an exhibition is organized. A group of 12 people sails from one island to another, searching, looking. Perhaps these islands are all the same island. Perhaps it's a kind of a floating island or some sort of ship or even a piece of flotsam. The expedition visits these various places, including the island where nothing was, as it's called. So the visitors let out a scream in order to leave something behind. So typical for Guðbergur, wonderful, poetic, ironic moment. So it's kind of a contrapuntal response to those who have found their Icelandic rock to stand on. But this is also then a response that is in some ways retracted in the aforementioned autobiographical books. The second of them, A Stone Buffed by the Ocean. What does that mean? Doesn't that mean that the ocean has actually polished this rock? And it's interesting that you can see that rock as being the author, but it could also be, of course, Iceland. Iceland is often simply called the rock. Okay. This novel has not been translated into English. In fact, very few of his works, for some reason. Okay, now I'm going to shift gears a little bit to a more general level of inquiry. How do we categorize Icelandic environments and literary sites? And I guess this similar kind of set of categories could be set up for different places, different countries. But I'm thinking here through the literature, but of course this has a general relevance as well. This uninhabited nature, highlands, lava fields, deserts, glaciers, of a tremendous importance in Icelandic literature from the start. There's the countryside and the rural areas, clearly the dominant narrative sphere up until well into the 20th century. There's villages and smaller towns, and then there's the city or the metropolitan area. And the city, there's only one. And And metropolitan is maybe even too grand a word to use for that area. I mean, but it's a fairly active place, even though the metropolitan area of Iceland there's probably about 70,000 people there now, and it has to serve a lot of functions, as it were. So it's a reasonably active, even though it's not very small. It's very spread out, actually. I'm told that it's like this city is. I mean, Victoria is quite spread out. I'm told that Reykjavik is the most spread out capital of the world. I'm not sure if that's absolutely correct. Now, there are other places. The question is, what about the ocean? Certainly there are works that take place partly out in the ocean on ships and so on. Very important, and of course, as a means of traveling and so on. So the ocean itself might have to be included. And then there's the island, the whole notion of an island, which I think is enormously important for the ways in which Icelanders think of their country, and I'm sure also the way in which foreigners think of Iceland. The way Iceland is a place in the mind has a lot to do with islandhood. And then, but of course, I'm sort of, one has to keep complicating this, the more works one sort of thinks of, and one have to accept, of course, that there are several Icelandic literary works that take place abroad, that don't have Iceland as a scene of action at all. But those works are still part of Icelandic culture, so in some way, that abroad is a perspective of, or gives us a perspective of Iceland. And then there are the many places that you might want to call non-places or counter spaces, fantastic realms, places that are radically made up by the writer, and you can't really pinpoint anywhere. And actually, fantasy literature has become quite popular in Iceland recently. Interesting development. As has crime fiction. There's a lot of sort of new developments in Iceland. Okay, now, just a few words about Halldór Laxness, who is, without a doubt, one of the great placemakers of the 20th century in Iceland. As soon as he became an important writer, that sort of happened in the 30s, he gradually became more and more important and very much debated up until the time he got the Nobel Prize in '55. Then his sort of position became absolutely kind of almost unquestioned as the king of modern Icelandic literature. In fact, the only writer who dared satirize Halldór Laxness was Guðbergur Bergsson, and basically making fun of some of the sort of quirks of Laxness and so on. And it took quite a bit of courage to do that in the 1960s when Guðbergur was still just a young writer. But through his novels, Salkavalka, Sjálfstætt Fólk, I'm just taking sort of the centerpiece there of his career. Salkavalka became, in a way, one of the works that defined the village, that new form of abode, as it were, in Iceland, the fishing village. That was represented in Salkavalka, and to some extent in Heimsljós, World Light. Sjálfstætt Fólk, of course, became the Icelandic farm. And in Íslandsklukkan, there we have this very interesting dialogue of different places. The dirt-poor farm, the well-to-do farm, Skálholt, the place of the bishop and seat of learning, Þingvellir, Parliament, and Copenhagen, the capital. Because what happened after the Reformation in 1550 is that even though Iceland had been a colony, it was only after the Reformation that Iceland got a Danish capital. You can't really talk about Copenhagen as the capital of Iceland until after the Reformation, when the king seized all that the enormous wealth and lands of the Catholic Church in Iceland and turned what had been sort of maybe a quasi-colony into a full-standing colony. So, history, there. You maybe sort of start thinking, wow, history must have something to do with this notion of place and identification. And it does, of course, we'll get back to that. And then Atomstöðin, the only real modern Reykjavik novel that Laxness wrote, and very important as such. So he has been very important in shaping modern Icelandic place identity, not only in literature but in general. But the village is interesting. I could give a whole lecture about the village in Icelandic literature, and it's in many ways that. Just as the island is a kind of a laboratory, the village is very often a kind of a social laboratory in Icelandic literary works, the novels especially, and in short stories. And besides Laxness, I would say that Guðbergur Bergsson and Steinar Sigurjónsson are the masters of the village in Icelandic literature. And the two of them are, of course, much more kind of a counter-reader of the village, showing its kind of all the disruptions and how it kind of incorporates the troubled dynamics of Icelandic society. And there's a title there by another writer that I find very symptomatic for what is being asked in many of these village novels, is "Átt þú heima hér?" Now it's not an easy. It's easy enough in Icelandic, but how do you translate that? Is this where you live? Átt þú heima? But the word heima is very important. But it's an adverb. It's not a noun. So how would you say it in English? Is this your home, or is this where you're at home? And so on. So the village, certainly in the works of Bergsson and Sigurðsson, and I think in Salkavalka, is often represented not as a fixed abode, but rather as a temporary and transient arrangement. And I'll get that back also later to that character of Icelandic places. Now, the countryside, as I mentioned before, is the archetypal scene of social life in a great deal of Icelandic literature. And it took a long time for Reykjavik to gradually move toward the center of this general consciousness of place. Reykjavik was, as I said, the 19th century just a village. Early 20th century was maybe, beginning of the 20th century, it was maybe 6,000-7,000 people, the population of Reykjavik. But now, of course, it has an overpowering kind of presence. But even in literature, it takes longer. It takes longer in the literary field to move center stage than it does in reality, because there's so much luggage in literature that it's a slower mode of traveling, as it were. It takes a while for a city in the making to take center stage. Two important writers in the post-Second World War period, Svava Jakobsdóttir in Leiðandinn, The Tenant. It's a wonderful novel. It's been translated into English. Describes what it's like to find a new settlement in an occupied country. Of course, Iceland was a place with a foreign military base. That's one thing. A country that had just declared full independence, become a republic, and Svava Jakobsdóttir describes so well how does a bourgeoisie come into being. There was no traditional bourgeoisie as in Europe. So a bourgeoisie had to be made up with all the kind of manners and behaviors and interactions and so on, and she captures that so wonderfully. Guðbergur Bergsson, once again, he's written so many important novels. In one of his best known ones, and one of the Reykjavik novels that he has written, Thomas Jónsson. Thomas Jónsson is an old man who's remembering, and he's remembering there how he moved hesitantly through the naked, doorless rooms in his newly built concrete basement flat. It's completely just been like so many. Reykjavik was built fairly rapidly around this at the time. Most of it concrete buildings. So different from the old Icelandic style of turf houses and turf and wood and all that. So it says that in the novel, I touch the house and drag the fingers down the wall, rough and pleasant under the fingertips, and my hand turns grey with cement dust. And with this grey dust, I impress my fingerprints on the windows. I think it just tells you about the search that is going on. Where have I ended up? What kind of place is this? What kind of city are we building? Did I? Yeah. Just again, gradually Reykjavik pushes more and more into the literature and sort of insists on the centrality. By the late 20th century and the turn of the century, we have novels that are very much kind of city novels, where there is no longer that kind of sense of attention between the city and the rest of the country. Gradually, the city sort of lives on itself, as it were. And not only that, but as you see, Hallgrímur Helgason, a novel that has been translated into English, 101 Reykjavik. 101 Reykjavik is just the center of the city. So it's not only that the city begins to exist in its own terms, but the center of the city becomes a place. And in this novel, the main character in 101 Reykjavik hardly ever leaves the center of the city. I mean, and he once he goes outside the city, into the country, and he becomes half scared. What? It's completely foreign territory. So it's sort of their novels. These three or four novels there are indications of how city life has taken one more step, where people can become just city dwellers. That becomes, in a way, the natural way of life. And yet, the country still beckons. The country out there, we say in Icelandic, úti á landi, out in the country. It's really an interesting phrase that sort of has solidified in the Icelandic language. So it's as if from a perspective of being in Reykjavik, and úti á landi is out there. And there are writers like Svanhildur Ragnarsdóttir, Undir Eldfjalli, short stories, and that particular short story, one of a brilliant work about a couple who've lived in the city for so long, but they find their own place, a home away from home, under a volcano, right close to Hekla, the famous volcano. And they create a beautiful garden there. They're retired, and they find their place there. And their children come, or their son and his wife come and visit. They say, "What are you doing here? Are you crazy? What are you going to do after the next eruption? And this might all just disappear." And they say, "Yes, well, so be it. This is what we're doing now. We've created this little place here, and of course, Iceland exists in some ways under a volcano." Ástráður, again, a novel where the protagonist leaves the city and finds a place of the heart, has a place of the heart out in the country. And one of our greatest contemporary writers, Gyrðir Elíasson, in work after work, keeps reminding us that Iceland as a whole is full of life, full of stories, full of history, full of myths, sort of reminding us city dwellers, there is so much going on beyond your horizon. Now, just briefly, the consciousness of place is also impacted by other factors, because I want to make sure that no one thinks that I'm just sort of, it's enough to sort of map this in a kind of a simplified geographic way. It's impacted by factors less directly territorial, but still geographical in a broad sense, in the sense of cultural geography, important for our perception, our worldview, including our sense of the connection between past and present, our notions of nationality, nature, urbanization, technology, and our awareness of our region's connections to other places and environments. Last but not least, it is infused with the legacy of narratives, texts, tones, and visual representations handed down from previous generations. And let me just briefly dip into Halldór Laxness again in Iceland's Bell. Ástráður, one of the three main characters in Iceland's Bell, is one of those Icelanders who had settled in Copenhagen. He had become a city dweller, but he's also someone who got to know Iceland better than anyone else. And the reason for that, well, it was at least twofold. He was a philologist who realized that it was the 12th hour, or 11th hour, we can say. The 11th hour, in order to save all the Icelandic manuscripts, one had to do something quickly, because they were gradually being destroyed, eroding. So many Icelanders who were not taking care of them. So he is the great collector of manuscripts, and he brought them all to Copenhagen because there was no place in Iceland to keep them at the time. And he's sort of one of the most important persons in Icelandic history because of the way in which he salvaged this tradition. But he is also someone who undertook to do a census in Iceland together with his friend Páll Vídalín in 1703, and that is the first census in the world of a whole nation. So he basically traveled through every piece of the Icelandic country, every part. And I can't quite remember, the Icelandic population at the time was 50,300 and something. Every single individual was written down, and their belongings, what the farmstead was like, and so on. So it was a remarkable feat. So in this novel, where he's called Ástráður, but this is Árni Magnússon, as everyone in Iceland will know, he says in one of his conversations, because he's a widely traveled man, "I am familiar, namely, with those countries to which my demon has drawn me," he continued, "compelling me, as it has done for so long, to search for my very own." So in his search, even though he knew contemporary Iceland so thoroughly, his search took him again and again into the past, into salvaging the historical hinterland of this nation. So you see how in many works this whole notion comes up, this searching for. It's not just I'm not so original that I'm making this up myself. So I want to end with one interesting piece of this search, because we're bound to ask, where is Iceland now? I want to step back a few years to 1991, when Þórarinn Eldjárn, one of our contemporary, well, he's a poet, he's a short story writer and a novelist as well, in fact. He wrote a poem called Staðarskáli Ísland. Staðarskáli is Iceland. Now, Staðarskáli is a roadside inn, sort of just on the main road between north and south in Iceland, and it's a place where a lot of people stop to have coffee or lunch or whatever, a hot dog, and they sit there for a while, and this is the new Ástráður. It was moved a few years ago, and it used to be on the other side of the river, but it's more or less the same place, and in fact, ironically, Þórarinn's poem is up on the wall there. So it's a big and it's quite interesting. It shows you that they feel honored that he actually wrote a poem about the place, and he called "This is Iceland." But of course, and they, I guess, just ignore the irony in the poem. But I've just it's such a magnificent piece, this poem, and I've just translated. I wasn't able to find an English translation, so I translated roughly. I'm trying to stick a little bit with. He's sometimes quite interesting and unusual in his wording. Ástráður Iceland. It begins like this: Ástráður is Iceland. A certain condensation of atmosphere brings about this fact. And then a few lines down, again, this is he's sort of written from within this place. The center of human traffic, the mecca of those who believe in the land. At this point of intersection, all lines crisscross, and there it becomes clear in the blink of an eye how our lives in this country are lived and truly spent. And then it ends with these 4 lines: "Here I want to while away the days of my life." So it's quoting Gunnar Solmi. Gunnar returned his. "Here I want to while away the days of my life, in a corner snugly, waiting for my meal, biding, tilting a Mimir's head modestly, taking it all in." Mimir, of course, was a god of wisdom in the old Nordic mythology, who was beheaded. I'm not going to go into that, but Odin, the king of the gods, was able to keep the head alive and consulted it in times of need. So this is the head of wisdom, Mimir. Now, what is Þórarinn saying? How can Ástráður be Iceland? Well, the one way to read it is that Icelanders have has Ástráður taken over from Þingvellir? Is that possible? I mean, that really sounds sacrilegious to a lot of my country folk. But it doesn't maybe mean it quite that way, but rather that Icelanders are in transition. They are on a journey, and they've stopped, and hopefully to think. As you know, since that poem was written, that journey has taken us into dangerous territories. But some people would call in the literature about in place studies, is this concept called non-place. But people who would say Ástráður is a typical non-place. It's not. It doesn't have the regular identity of places. It's just a place like an airport lounge, or so. It's when you're in transition. But then we may ask, this is 1991. This is before some very important things happened in our communication, and so we may ask, where is Iceland now? Tilting its Mimir's head. And I'm not going to go into all. I mean, we can maybe talk about that, but so that's where I'll end. Thank you.